Howdy, y'all. This is Future Kurt speaking here. And just to give you some context, we recorded this episode in July of 2024, and the idea is that I was going to take a little bit of time to edit it, get it out there. It was going to sit with our Patreon supporters for a couple months, and then I was going to release it as like a Christmas bonus and treat like I had done last year with the second panel. And due to some recording issues that were present, I think caused by my aging dinosaur of a laptop, I know my audio dropped off at times, and I had to do my wizardry behind the scenes to make sure that I captured the questions again in the post editing process, and to just make sure that everyone else sounded great and wonderful. So that's the explanation as to why this has taken so long to get out. And again, fun surprises along the way as we'll learn. And here at the top of the show, I know it'll get mentioned in the very end in the plugs and the credits from everyone. But Alyssa Visscher, one of our panelists, did get to consult on the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's really interesting now to go back and listen to this with the context and understanding that, she's under an NDA, and so she can't exactly talk about any insider knowledge about the newer rules and stuff like that. But, I certainly think her insights and opinions, and all of my panelists had some great, perspectives to provide on this topic that's discussed. So without further ado, here is the Parleys at the Platter number 3.
Hark the bardic paladin, who sings and plays again. He tells the tales of glory and weaves a magic story. He'll join you at your table and ask you to share a fable. Heroes of humble origin, villains who must be fought again. No matter their skill or prowess, the people in life are countless. So we pray you heed our request. Enjoy this tale of sidekicks and side quests. And side quests.
Hello, and welcome to our third ever panel style episode of our series of discussions that we call the Parleys at the Platter. The goal is to invite guests of the podcast who share a similar field of expertise or passion, to invite them to come together and have a lovely hour or so on the topic. Our topic for this panel is entitled Game Design, Play, and D&D, and it seeks to find the intersection of these three ideas. So we're in the 50th anniversary year of D&D, and possibly the entire TTRPG hobby as a whole, and with the various ups and downs via management decisions of TSR, then Wizards of the Coast, and now Hasbro, the doors have been opened even wider to other kinds of third-party content creators and indie games, and just general conversations continue to happen on philosophies on game design as we are in the 14th year, of 5th edition. So an updated rule set is set to premiere this September 2024, with some wondering if this is merely a revision, is it 5.5, or are we already talking about version 6? But let's save some of those questions for the panel, why don't we? So I'm joined by wonderful guests of the podcast. Those of you who are wealthy and aristocratic level of patronage on our Patreon are hearing this as an early release on Patreon. And if you want to be able to hear this early as well and not wait for it to drop on the general RSS feed, then you should consider joining us on Patreon. So, to begin my introductions of the panel, my first guest is a professor in the computer science department at Ball State University. Much of his teaching, research, and service connect to his interest in game design and development. He has been working with multidisciplinary undergraduate teams to create original games with community partners for over 15 years. Past partners have included the Indiana State Museum, the Children's Museum in Indianapolis, Minnetrista Museum and Gardens, and Muncie Public Library. In addition to producing several award-winning games, he has authored or co-authored over a dozen scholarly articles related to his work in game design and development. When he is not working on university business, he can be found playing board games, participating in game jams, making music, or otherwise spending time with his wife and 4 sons. You will recognize this panelist as the maker behind Shango, the Deep Scion High Priest, featured in episode number 93. Please welcome Dr. Paul Gestwicki.
Thanks, Kurt. That Shango episode is still one of the wildest things I've done in the last 10 years. That was a good time, so I'm really glad to be back.
Indeed, indeed. And my second guest frequently rambles on Twitter about D&D and especially enjoys analyzing its overall structure from a newbie perspective. She loves breaking down larger concepts to small, bite-sized pieces, and her articles about the game have been published with D&D Beyond. She's a freelance writer with her inaugural adventure reaching bestseller status on the DM's Guild. She's a parent of 4, neurodivergent, disabled wheelchair user, and is impressively terrible at small talk. You will recognize this panelist as the inspiration behind Ashira, the Bearfolk Druid Herbalist, featured in episode number 89. Give a great white northern howdy to Alyssa Visscher.
Hi, I'm so pleased to be here and I'm really excited to dig into chatting with these incredible folks.
Wonderful. Our third panelist is the creator behind the Sterling Vermin Adventuring Company and one half of the Dispel Magic podcast. His self-published works are bestsellers on the DM's Guild. He's won a Silver Ennie Award and is a contributor on multiple successful TTRPG and other tabletop game Kickstarter campaigns. If you love playing third-party classes for 5th edition D&D, you will recognize his work. Premier among them, The Pugilist, which has been featured in a number of actual play broadcasts on the internet, as well as The Magus, The Scholar, The Spiritualist, The Zephyr, The Thaumaturge, and most recently, a custom sheepfolk ancestry, The Baba. He is an accomplished freelancer with design and writing credits with Ghostfire Gaming, Magehand Press, and Hitpoint Press, and is available for freelance game design, narrative design, and writing in tabletop and video games. You will recognize this guest as the maker of Katniss, one half of a pair of Hexblood siblings who are fantasy game designers and Magic Mouth Stonecasters, not unlike himself in real life. So, featured in episode number 96. So give a loud hurrah for Benjamin Huffman.
Hi, Kurt. Great to be here. I'm excited about this chat.
There we go. Our fourth and final panelist comes to us from across the pond in merry old England. Hopefully I won't do that the whole panel. I will behave, don't worry. Of the United Kingdom. His work has been featured in MCDM Productions Arcadia, The Witcher TTRPG, Cyberpunk Red, Pathfinder 2E, Starfinder, Dungeons & Dragons, Magic the Gathering, and many other systems, too. In fact, this panelist is the original creator of the combat wheelchair rules for 5th edition, which, Matt Mercer famously went on to use these rules to introduce the Dwarven Tracker, Dagon Underthorn, and Critical Role's Mighty Nine campaign, a very popular NPC of that campaign. The character he brought to the podcast for his episode was his original first ever D&D character that has since been immortalized and featured in the successful mobile game Idle Champions. The episode you will recall hearing this panelist from is episode number 67, the famous NPC Talon Urin of the Bragan Darth. So a royally sized welcome to our guest, Mark Thompson.
Hi, Kat. Thank you for asking me to come on. I'm really excited to just chat with everyone.
Wonderful. So this third time of me doing panel episodes is a little different than how I normally do things. So I like this to be fun and cool and just easy going. So maybe we'll just go ahead and start with the questions. So I have some questions that I've prepared, and obviously I've encouraged all my panelists to be able to come up with their own, whether they are prepared or they're just spur of the moment. But I'll go ahead and start us off with one. Maybe it's easy, maybe it's not, but panelists, what is play?
Well, nobody go first here.
One of my favorite things to do as a professor is teach my Introduction to Game Design course. I actually haven't been able to teach it in a little while, but that's a whole different story. But I have the first day of the class, I have a slide deck. It's the only day when I use slides. But I have a series about what is play and what is a game. So I did my homework on this one question. Everyone else can answer the other ones, right? Here's my favorite one. Bernard Suits, in his book, The Grasshopper, described play as a voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And I just think that's poetic. I think it's beautiful. A voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. It doesn't answer questions about why we do it, right? Like there's all kinds of questions and answers and research around that. But I think Bernard Suits kind of nails it with that poetic response. So that's my answer. Thank you.
I don't think you're going to get a better answer than that. That seems pretty definitive.
I think that covers so many things, but a couple of months ago when I was researching some things regarding my kids, I ran into just this quote on one of the Canadian government websites about how play is the business of childhood. And that has been something that has just rattled around in my brain on and off since then. Because I think that as adults, we have a hard time with play unless we sit down to do it really like intentionally, like playing a game. And I think that play and engaging with play really harkens back to like our childhood and helps us to like re-engage with all of those things. And I just love that idea that it is like quintessentially about childhood.
I promise I won't be like a teacher that'll just call on everyone to want to answer. Certainly, I want to encourage everyone to be able to get an answer in. But if you don't want to, that's cool too. Everyone was giving such wonderful definitions of what they think play is. And I'm currently in the midst of fatherhood with my first child, my son, who's 3. And so, just thinking about play and like how play has changed, between his different stages of development. Like, oh, he's just a potato. He was adorable, but his play was just like, practicing being on his tummy or like laying on his back and playing with a mobile. And then play was like crawling around and then figuring out how to walk and then babbling and learning to talk. And, we took our big trip at the beginning of the year to go to Hawaii. And of course, now he has his big phone, which is a tablet, which is how we've been able to survive a plane trip across the Pacific Ocean. And then on days when, it's just hard to parent on a particular day because someone's sick or someone's busy working or doing this or that. And now watching him play with his educational games and stuff on his iPad versus like him dancing and interacting around his songs or something that's on YouTube, or even just, he coming to me and his mother, just saying like, hey, come play with me. And, he wants to like roughhouse or he wants to, play pretend or do something. So it's really cool. And how much like what play looks like for a 3-year-old. And then me, that's like play is like, I get to, when I'm done with work and put my son to bed, I get to do a podcast where I get to be make-believe with a guest and come up with a character. And that's what play is for me. And it's like a way that I can relate to my son in that same regard of play, even though like, I'm vastly older and feel mature, but really I'm not. I'm just a big fraud.
Yeah, I mean, play is biologically like wired into our brains, right? Like it's one of the foundational sets of like circuits that we are born with. There's some interesting work by Jaak Pansiep that I had to relook up in preparation for this because again, it was something that I had delved into researching a number of years ago with my kids. And just that idea that it is hardwired straight into our brain, like these circuits in our midbrain, and it is a biological like process. And I think that also just speaks to the inherent like importance of it. Like it is something that we're born with. Everybody can do it. It doesn't matter how what your age is. It doesn't matter what your capacity is. Everybody can do that. It is just a straight up function of our brains, and I just think that's really cool that we're born with it.
That's the guy that studied the rats, right? The rats that play with each other. I forgot his name. The scholar you mentioned, Alyssa.
I think so. Yeah, he's done some work already, spanning the 90s, and some study into the different kinds of play and the types of play. So some sort of that foundational work there. But I don't know that we always think about play as being like a biological thing. I think that we think about it as being primarily just like a social, like learned thing. And not that it isn't, but it starts with the way that we are wired already from birth.
Yeah, I feel like it's a means to interact with and understand other people and even other like animals as well, because animals are like also have play. Like I think it's called like non-reward play, where they just instigate a game, but there's no real reward to it other than there's just fun. Like, you know, they've seen it with otters making slides down snowy banks or crows rolling down roofs and things because they just simply find it fun. And I think we see it more, like humans tend to see it more as like a social thing, like you said, Alyssa, because we don't really think of ourselves as animals, but we are, and it's still like a very much ingrained thing that we use to like communicate with one another, like even though we don't perceive it to be that way. It's how we understand other people, like learn their limitations the same way that like a puppy learns not to bite so hard by biting other puppies and learning how hard you're meant to bite, that kind of thing.
There's all kinds of neat stuff in there. This idea of play, I mean, the three of you have all mentioned this idea already, right? That there's something about our mammalian roots that make us want to play. And one of the things I come across a lot is this idea that play is practice for the future, especially with children, right? Or small animals, right? It's practice for the future. And it makes me think back to my first D&D group, which was a multi-generational, multi-ethnic group. And I was in 8th grade or 9th grade or something. And that was so influential on me to play with these people who superficially didn't look like me or behave like me, but we had a wonderful play experience. I reflect on that a lot when I'm on committees and stuff, or just working with people who you might say, well, this person looks or thinks differently, but it doesn't matter. We can still play with ideas, because I think of my work as being a form of play, right? That I'm playing with new ideas as a researcher, and I'm sure everybody has this in different degrees. But there's a dark side to it too, because I know from game design, and I'm sure many of you have seen this. If you know the circuits that get people hooked on play, you can do it for bad purposes, right? You can search for whales with your mobile game, right? So these same innate wirings we have to enjoy play can be abused for bad purposes. And that's something I try to talk to my students about too, and when we talk about ethics of game design. And then I don't know, Kurt, if that's a direction you wanted to go in with this episode or not.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
To me, that's really interesting. There's a inherent goodness about play, but there's also an opportunity for bad actors to take advantage of people. So the ethical argument comes in, which is interesting, I think.
I think also as well, like to add on to that, it's like when you have a bad play experience as well, like you tend to learn from it regardless. So like for your example, like with your D&D group, my first D&D group was horrible. It was a terrible experience. Mm-hmm. 4th edition in high school. At the time, I was the only femme presenting person at the table. My character was reduced to damsel in distress all the time. Didn't have much like autonomy in the play like everybody else had, so that really sucked, and it put me off D&D for ages until I got to university. I was like, well, I'll try again because it's a new edition and I've got people that like I know and I'm friends with and would like to try with, and had a really good experience. And then I was like, oh, okay then, so like as a DM I know what to avoid because I've been in a really terrible group before, and now I know how to run it well. So you still learn even from like really bad, unfortunate experiences like that.
Great.
Everyone's had their turn to talk about play. Again, this is just free form, and I just try and feel it out and just make sure if we're good to move on to the next question, I can roll on to the next question. Okay. All right. Cool. All right, so, a collection of game designers here before me. Why do people love to play role-playing games? I mean, I know the way I would answer it is like, Lord of the Rings was hugely influential in my junior high, going into high school years. Of course, the Peter Jackson trilogy prompted me ever having read Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and all that. And, fun stuff. Plug to our last panel episode that we did on Catholicism, Tolkien, and D&D, which was very cool. But yeah, all of that I think helped prompt me to be like, oh yeah, I've played video games where I get to be like a character, and then starting college and getting Fallout 3 in New Vegas, and then it finally wasn't until my second senior year of college, my undergraduate took me 5 years as a music major to pick up 4th edition, and then I was like, oh, this is cool. Yeah, I want to do this. And so then getting to be with my friends around a table. So yeah, I think it was bred early on in me in like the sweeping stories and movies that I grew up on, to the games, the video games that I played and the board games I played, to then actually get to the granddaddy tabletop game of itself, to be able to enjoy it. So I think it's being the character, going on the adventure, having the quest, having the excitement, the thrill, the drama, and all that. And yeah, I'm just a big old sucker for it.
I think another angle people kind of tend to say a lot as well is the escapism of it. But like a lot of people tend to think that that's like you play the polar opposite, of who you are in real life. But a lot of the time, I think it's, at least in my circles that I've played with friends with, it's very strange if somebody hasn't put at least a little bit of something of themselves in their character, whether that's a physical trait or an emotional trait or an experience that character had that the player can relate to. And I think that there are different levels of escapism as well, and whatever you want to get out of the game, if you communicate with your DM and your friends and other players and stuff, you should be able to get that out of the game, and you should be able to have fun. A level of escapism for me is I get a lot of people go, oh, but you're disabled, like you wouldn't want to be in a wheelchair in D&D because why would you want to do that? It's like, but I would like to be able to play a character in a wheelchair where that's not an issue for anybody, where the world is accessible and I can go and do everything that an able-bodied character can do, and still have like fun and go on an adventure and be seen and be valued as somebody who contributes to the party, rather than how we normally see people who are disabled in fantasy, where they are tended to be treated as a hindrance or they need to be fixed in some way. So for me, that's a level of escapism that I think, at least in like the kind of like general perception of D&D and escapism, that people seem to think that can't exist, that disabled people surely don't want to play themselves. And it's like, no, they would like to play, a disabled character. And I think that that's important. And I think that's also, like, at least for me, a level of why I really enjoy like playing role-playing games.
Yeah, I would, as also somebody who uses a wheelchair and other mobility devices, I would, like, you all can't see me here, listeners, but I'm just like emphatically nodding to everything that Mark is saying, because that is like 100%. I think that people play in order to, I would argue that there's a whole pile of reasons why people play. And I think that there is a lot of, you can get into the nitty gritties of like the types of play and the different kinds of genres and why people play all those kinds of things, right? Why do people engage in a particular style of play? But I think that it comes down to the idea of like self-exploration and being able to explore different facets of one's identity in a safe place. And that, for me, it's kind of like the Schitt's Creek of D&D, the idea of like, Schitt's Creek becomes this show where you go, wow, like we have queer people that experience no like queer phobia at all. Like, what is this kind of like, what could this be like? Having disabled folks and having the opportunity for disabled people to play, in an accessible world is that thing. And then I think it also allows people to explore the idea of like pushing into different parts of themselves that they hadn't played around with. I did not realize I was autistic until I decided to play specifically an autistic character. And I did that because I wanted to explore aspects of the world from my kids who were diagnosed autistic. And then I was like, oh, hi, they got it from somewhere. This is me. I'm the problem. Right? So, it becomes a safe place to explore things that and maybe that you don't know at the same time.
some part of what both of you just brought up, Alyssa and Mark, what you both brought up really resonated with me. So I'm going to try to like see if I can hold two thoughts at once and get them all out and sound coherent. But the first one is that I'm a therapist by day, a psychotherapist by day, so talk therapy. And when you talk about playing in role-playing games, it's kind of an exploration of the self. There's a theory of therapy called Gestalt, which is all about giving voice to the like kind of unheard parts of yourselves, or trying to kind of get your different versions that are different voices within you in alignment so that you can live without the kind of whatever your problems are. And I think it's interesting, Mark, that you suggested that people usually play the opposite of them. I don't know if I've seen that a lot, but I do feel like people are always telling on themselves a little bit with the characters that they play. It's always like a thought that they've had or a behavior that they want to experiment with in a safe place. I know that I repeatedly played villains with redemption arcs. Can only imagine what that says about me, but that's just, I like to be the guy who starts off bad and then is redeemed by the end. So yeah, just to say, I like that. I like thinking about that and about how to people, well, tell on themselves, I guess. And then the other thing, Alyssa, that you mentioned was this idea that there are a lot of reasons people come to the game. And I think that's super true. And the most like robust answer to the question of why do people play role-playing games is that some people play it simply because they like rolling dice. Like they just like that sound that it makes or whatever. Some people are playing because the social structure makes it easier for them to engage with than kind of other social situations. And so this is a very safe place for them to be themselves and to try out socializing. Some people really love stories. And so they're here for the story. And some people want to participate in system mastery. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen forums or online conversations about like how to build the best X character. And it's all because that the reason that they really like role-playing games is because they're really into knowing every little rule of the game so they can figure out how to do this thing that maybe you're probably not supposed to actually be able to do in the game, but they figured it out. Yeah, that's me.
I know that I had a long answer here, but I just wanted to tack on to that the idea of like what you said about being a therapist. And I think that part of the reason we're seeing like a huge resurgence in TTRPGs, I think comes to the like the bit of the millennial like therapeutic path. So many of us sort of like deconstructing, evangelicism or different aspects of our trauma, finding out that we're undiagnosed ADHD or undiagnosed autistic. I think that a big part of the widespread kind of movement plays into that idea that, like that therapeutic gestalt aspect, being able to work through this kind of like generational traumas that we have through play.
Yeah, absolutely.
It reminds me of just a very quick story, thinking, Mark, about your comment about the starting off with a very bad group. The one very terrible experience I had in tabletop role-playing games was a session where I didn't know anybody there. I just got invited, and I came in with a cleric with the lowest possible wisdom you could have and be a cleric. And he had a really high charisma, just tried to convert people to a religion he didn't understand. And I thought that would be a lot of fun. Everybody else at the table was playing min-maxed elves because they had sleep resistance, right? So like I come in with this intentionally underpowered, interesting story character, not knowing that everyone else was there for this purpose of crushing bad guys. And so, it was just a one-off, and that was it. That's how it goes sometimes.
Yeah, to add on to like that, like discovering and working through things about yourself as well. The character that Kurt mentioned that I made on this podcast a while ago, Talon, really helped with his backstory. Involves him being able-bodied up until about the age of 24, I think it is, and then all of a sudden is in an accident and is left paralyzed from the waist down. And whilst that isn't like my physical disability, mine is hypermobile type Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, there's still that like shared like sudden you can't do those things you could do before. And a lot of Talon's like character and his backstory, and up to when I started playing him, was he was still quite bitter about that. and hadn't quite worked through it. And it was something that I was working through with my therapist at the time, because it was a lot of internalized ableism, and that was one of the reasons that I wanted to make the combat wheelchair rule set. Is because I wanted there to be positive representation, because if I felt like crap, I'm sure that there were a lot of other disabled people out there who also felt the same way. And if I could make something that just at least improved it somewhat, and could help people work through that in a kind of healthy way that also works with the game very well, then yeah, I wanted to do that. And it was very much a big part of healing and coming to terms with a lot of the internalized ableism and stuff that I'd had from childhood.
All right, in our next question here, what is one of the greatest innovations of D&D, and what is one of the greatest challenges for D&D?
I think D&D's biggest innovation recently is honestly the journeys through the Radiant Citadel. I think that's probably some of the best work that they've done. I think that that's the closest sort of that they've come to innovate. I think that their challenges, this isn't a new thought, of course, but their challenges is that their audience is wide and broad, and this is like an extra large tent kind of a game, and its history. D&D was made for white, able-bodied, cis, heterosexual men, and the history is kind of that big piano that you're dragging behind your butt. And they've done a lot of great work towards making it more inclusive, towards removing a lot of the systemic racism and misogyny that is there, but they can't do anything super innovative, because you have your history, your historical, OG crowd, who doesn't want it. They don't want innovation from D&D. They want to be able to keep playing the game that they know and love. And so I think that the side cart offering of Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel is some of the best world building work that they have done. And I would probably put that on the trophy shelf for their best innovation.
I feel like adding on to that, that crowd that wants D&D to kind of stay the same as it always has. It's in my experience, it's a small part of the community, and yet they have the biggest voice when it comes to crying about it online a lot of the time, for lack of a better way of describing it. And it also feels that because of that, as somebody who does a lot of homebrew for D&D and things like that, that it feels like D&D has come to rely a lot on third party and homebrew a lot for anything innovative or brand new to the game, and because of that, it feels like D&D, anytime they kind of bring something new out, with the exception of Radiant Citadel, because I do agree it was very good world building, everything else is kind of very vanilla, and when they do change things, it's a very safe change, because they don't want to rock the boat, I guess, which sucks, because I know that there are a lot of really amazing game designers and writers for D&D who could come up with some really interesting and compelling lore, and yet I feel personally like they're not really being given the chance to, for the sake of this small part of your audience, especially since lockdown happened and D&D and tabletop as a whole kind of exploded, because everyone could do it, right? On Zoom and stuff. So you have more people than ever, like you said, these broad, varied people with loads of different life experiences and things, and they aren't being represented in the game because they tend to want to play it safe just for the sake of that small but very loud, unfortunately, voice. So yeah, I feel that that's something that kind of holds D&D back. For me, it's a very big challenge for them, I think. And like you said, whilst they have made efforts to take strides in that direction, there are still things that they play very safe on, and yeah, don't want to kind of stir up those people. But I feel like if they did, those people would just have to get over it, because a lot of the time the stuff that's in those core rulebooks are optional flavor stuff. So if you don't like something, just don't use it. That's what I don't get when people like go off on like whole rants about how it doesn't fit into D&D, or this isn't classic D&D. And it's like, well, just don't use it then. Nobody's making you use it at your table. Like, nobody is. If you don't like something, discuss it with your DM or, you know, with other players and things like that. You know, you're supposed to work together to kind of build the game that you want to play. At least that's my, you know, experience with tabletop. You get what you want out of the rule set. So yeah, like I feel, like I said, that's just a really big challenge for D&D as a whole. And I feel like some of the tabletops have that issue as well, but D&D seems to be the biggest one that I think has that really big challenge and a big step to make. And I think that's, like you said, because of like all that like extensive history and the past with the very many missteps that they've made in the past, and like how they've got to sort that out, correct it, and do better going forward.
I have basically the same answer, but coming at it from a slightly different angle, which is that I agree that the innovation and challenge are mirrors of each other, and I also agree that it's mostly the audience, its relationship with the audience. But I guess I'll just say that I think it's broader than just like kind of issues of like making D&D more just and available to broader audiences. It's also, I think that the greatest innovation of D&D, like since its conception, I thought it was 4th edition. 4th edition was the only edition that said, okay, we're going to forget everything we've done so far. We know what's supposed to happen when you play D&D. So what if we built rules for that? Like, instead of just using the old things that kind of we keep on cobbling new things together, we're just going to build a from scratch system to do what you're supposed to do in D&D. And people hated it, or at least a lot of people hated it, or at least enough people hated it and were extremely vocal about it online and in forums or whatever, that the general consensus was that it was hated. But it was the best version of D&D. It was the best version of D&D because it was specifically created to do the fantasy of D&D. And when we went back to 5th edition, you know, or 5th edition was created, I think, if I'm remembering history correctly, in large part there was a lot of roping in people from the OSR community and from other like kind of older edition, like fans of older editions, and saying like, how can we placate as many historical fans of the game as possible? That was a big goal with 5th edition. I don't think that's necessarily bad, you know, but it does show how like D&D is so tied to its history that it can't become, that it has difficulty becoming a better version of itself, because there are people who like the past that they imagine in their own mind better than the future that, you know, could be better.
I would agree with that, and I think if anybody's been on my Twitter, I am constantly reposting several like ranty threads that I wrote about, you know, 4th edition and its strengths and how it was received in the community, and how in the, you know, the D&D Next playtest, a lot of the surveys and the questions revolved around like, does this feel like D&D to you? Because again, they're trying to harken back, like you said, Benjamin, to that OSR, those, you know, 2nd edition folks. And I think that that's part of the issue that we just saw in the last, you know, year of Unearthed Arcanas, as we're heading to like this next iteration of D&D, is that they started off really, you know, throwing more wild ideas on the table, and a lot of this sort of resounding feedback was, don't muck with my D&D, don't muck with my game. And so there's the folks that want innovative play, and innovative, you know, game design, and innovative, you know, kinds of, you know, adventures or whatever. I think that they find those kind of, they get that elsewhere. They end up branching out from D&D into other games and finding, you know, the indie folks who are doing that, and D&D becomes kind of like the comfort food. Like, it's your chips and Cheetos or whatever is your, you know, your comfort food that's going to remain fairly steadfast, even if, you know, for some folks it can feel like that steadfastness can sometimes feel a little bit stagnant. I think it just that idea of they just don't want they don't want that kind of innovation. They want it to stay.
You know, I'm from the past. And I'm reminded of something really interesting that Ralph Koster either wrote or said once when he was talking about Monopoly. Everybody I've met hasn't played Monopoly. They've played another game with the Monopoly pieces, right? You throw in house rules, like putting money on free parking, and now you're playing another game and calling it Monopoly. And Dungeons and Dragons, in this conversation and the broader conversation, I think has that problem. Because the first time I played D&D was first edition AD&D in middle school or so. And it's unrecognizable. Fifth edition is unrecognizable to that, right? Like those are different worlds. But to call them both Dungeons and Dragons is I think we have to define our terms. I guess it was the same. We have to define our terms, right? So, for example, going into fifth edition, advantage and disadvantage is a fantastic innovation. I think that's a wonderful mechanism. What's that? Well, I never played fourth edition. Just at all. Yeah,
like that's just fascinating. That right? Like that just pulls back to what Benjamin said.
Right. But also the way that in first edition the creators were able to take things like that wonderful cheesy movie The Raven and take the terrible practical special effects and make them into an actual systematized magic system based on the stories written by Jack Vance, like that's an innovation, right? That's incredible. And that's something that nobody's done since, right? Right? Like there's been no innovation in that space because it's been done, right? So I think it's a tricky thing. I guess my point is if you change anything, it's not the same anymore, right? Without THACO, to me, it's not Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm old, right? I would be real careful about saying if you just want to say whatever the current thing is that somebody tells me is Dungeons and Dragons, that's fine. But I don't think that's technically right? If fourth edition was so different, it's really a different thing than fifth edition. And they're simply not the same. It's just something somebody's selling you. I'm sympathetic to the business needs. I really am. But also, like, I could play my second edition stuff. You could play your fourth edition stuff. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But they're not the same game because they're not the same, right? They capture different ethos. They capture different spirits. Well, your commentary just about like what it feels like to be a millennial, right? I'm not one, right? But many of you are kind of nodding your heads at this idea, like these cultural shifts are significant, and that's also not irrelevant to this question of what is the thing we're actually talking about. I'm not sure it's one thing. I think it's a constellation of things. And I like THACO.
Insert part here where I must have provided my own answer and I made allusions to Baldur's Gate 3.
I actually can say almost nothing about it. I haven't looked into Baldur's Gate. I'm familiar with the phenomenon around it, but it seems to reflect this idea again of cultural contexts, right? I think about how I know the X-Men because I read X-Men comics, and my brother, who's 9 years younger than me, knows the X-Men because he watched the cartoon. And our understanding of what X-Men is not the same, right? Once you get beyond Wolverine has claws, right? Like it really is different. Even to call that the same thing X-Men, like, no, you got a whole different set of writers now. Again, I know we're not talking about comics, right? But I think the same thing's true in this space. I didn't come of age in an era where you could tune into people watching. I had one copy of White Dwarf magazine, and everything I know about miniature painting was from that one copy of the magazine. It was just a different time. Yeah, and that's, again, if you young folks want to hear about those times, Graybeard could tell you about those. But yeah, it was simply different. I mean, it was not popular. Nobody, right? You got mercilessly teased if people found out you were playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? I have a good friend who's a professional game developer who would secretly go to the library and make sure nobody's looking at him when you go to check out the rule book to go see how the game was played, right? It was a different time. It was simply a different time when you were coming of age in, when was that? Late 80s, early 90s. So it is what it is. Things change.
The question I have is, in the D&D community, there's a lot of effort, or I guess community, when I say community, I more mean audience. There's a lot of effort made to distinguish homebrewers from third-party content from official content. It's interesting to navigate that as a professional in that marketplace, or trying to attract that audience. But I also wonder what the panelists would say that says about play or the TTRPG audience, that it's very important to them to know what's official and what's not official, and to have this very clearly, to have strict ideas about what it would mean for it to be official versus not official, and that maybe official automatically equates to good in some people's minds, and unofficial automatically equates to bad, or let's trust this less.
The way that I think about that whole sort of like subject is fanfic. Like, I think that homebrew and third-party work is to like D&D, like fan fiction and like AO3 is to literary, right? You know, you got people who are on, you know, for those who are not familiar, Archive of Our Own, for example, right? Just chock full of fanfic. Some of it's real good, some of it's real not good, and that is like how folks engage with you know, their favorite books or their favorite movies or their favorite whatever is creating their own versions of these things, or adding in new chapters, or just writing something of their own. And I think that that's like homebrew is how the D&D community engages in a fan way. And, you know, on the fanfic side, you have a lot of, you know, in recent years, there are a lot of like new in the last decade authors who have come like out of like AO3, who have gotten, you know, the ability to either, you know, get a publishing deal with like a, you know, brick and mortar type publisher, or be able to self-publish, right? And there is a rough correlation as to the quality. Something being published and self-published isn't a guarantee, but it tends to be of higher quality. It tends to be able to maybe like go through an editing process. It tends to be something that somebody sat down with and went through multiple drafts and thought about it. And that is, I think, what we get in like third-party publishers. And I think that when people want to know if something is good or not, I think they want to know, is this something that is the equivalent of a random, you know, quick written down on a fanfic website? Did I just throw it on, you know, Homebrewery or whatever? Or has this gone through like multiple iterations? Has it gone a balance pass? And if it feels or looks legitimate, right, it gives me a better leg to stand on, a better, you know, sturdier chair to stand on when I take this to my DM and I say, hey, I found this thing that really hits some of the flavors or the mechanics or the themes that I want to explore. It's good. I promise it's not super broken. Can I, you know, I got it from insert, you know, designer, well-known designer, or insert, you know, a better or more well-known publisher here. Will you let me play it? And the DM can see again that it has, you know, gone through that and isn't simply a fan's, you know, homage to Dungeons and Dragons. That was, you know, a fever dream put on paper, which is fun, but may not be great or playable. That's my ramble on that.
Insert here where I must have delivered some sort of poignant or cool answer, and I don't have it, and now it's going to get thrown back to Alyssa to provide some more context and insight.
I think it harkens back to our first discussions about play. It is just another way to play with it, and I think it's good. Like, I don't want anybody to think that I'm pooing on fanfic or anything. I think I read way too much stuff on AO3, and I read actually also good books. I think, you know, I think that either way is fine as long as what you want and what works for you and for your table.
Yeah, I mean, for me, homebrew has always been less about trying to sell my ideas to people and more, I see a piece missing through interacting with the game or having friends play games with me, and here's a way I can fill it for them. and I think it's fun to share it with my friends, and then I just slap it online, and if people want to use it as well, like, you know, more fun for them. So like, you know, for example, with like the combat wheelchair, that literally was just a friend at the table being like, oh, I think it'd be really cool if I could play a character in a wheelchair. And I was like, do you know what? I'll do it. And then it was literally just a rule set of just 3 actions in a wheelchair that you could take. It's now like a 70-something page document, and version 4 is on the way now. So, you know, it's fun to like especially like with how I found it is like filling in like those niches, and then you realize that there's another niche that needs to be filled, and then like you can kind of just keep going. Like the combat wheelchair led into me being when I was doing all the subclasses, and I got to Mercer's Blood Hunter subclass, which I made a disability version for, and I was like, oh, it'd be really cool if like you could actually play something very solidly like a Witcher without having to like fully be like, you know, it wouldn't work entirely in the game, but here's like a version for D&D. So I made that, and I made it the Wofsa, with the name being Polish for hunter, because the Witcher is Polish, so, you know, and like for that audience, and that filled a niche for me because I wanted to play a character who was a Witcher, and there wasn't a lot there that like I felt accurately represented my understanding of the books and games. And then after that, you know, I went into making things for other games as well, especially like when I've played a game that I tend to know like the lore of pretty solidly. So things like Dragon Age and like The Witcher, and I'm like, oh, we haven't actually had this like turn up in like the actual official rule set. So here's like a version of this one thing that's mentioned on one page in a book that I thought was a really cool idea. So here's me making, you know, a whole homebrew for it. And anybody else who happened to enjoy it, like, can also then use it as well. So yeah, like you said, it's very much about that, like, it's a way, at least for me, to show appreciation for the games, like, and it kind of reflects players' like engagement with the game, because you can see clearly what they thought was lacking, and like they're almost like I guess like the best way to describe it is they're almost like love letters basically to the games that they're making them for, whether that's because they want to critique something in it, or they think something can be improved upon, or they've had this brand new idea that they think is really cool and like, you know, is kind of off the rails but would actually be really fun if you could have it in game. Yeah, I think it shows a real appreciation for like the core rule set, whatever game it is, or like whatever media it's based on. And it, yeah, you get like all of these reflections of different players, and you kind of get to know the broader audience of like these games beyond just your table, just through like looking through homebrew. The same way, like you said with AO3, like you'll be browsing through the pages and all of a sudden someone's like, oh, here's like a Star Wars fanfic if this one thing happened instead, and here's like 100 like chapter like whole alternate universe, and it's really, really good, and it has no right being that good, but it's good. You know, and you get like a feeling for, oh my god, like there are people who have these ideas that like I'd never thought of before, and that's so cool. Like that I have a new appreciation for the thing that I originally enjoyed through someone making something else from it. And I think that's just really cool.
So Ben, I had heard a part of your question, and I don't know if this was my misinterpretation or not, dealing with this problem that in the audience of Dungeons and Dragons there's a difference, a separation, like a consideration that official stuff is good and other stuff might not be. But I know you've written a lot of content, and I'm wondering, like, what is your answer to that part of the question about getting your ideas in front of people who would be amenable to accepting them? Like, are there places where you think are useful for creators to go and show their stuff that's better than other places, or is it just kind of a crapshoot?
I didn't expect the turnaround. Should have been prepared, yeah, for the reverse Uno card. Well, gosh, there's a lot there. In terms of how to get it out in front of people, I mean, I just started putting it out in front of people. You know, I think any online forum I could find where I could host stuff, I would throw it up. I would be very engaged with people. And this is kind of like, I started doing this, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years ago, I think. But that's only when I started doing it professionally. I have notebooks from when I was 11 or 12 years old and playing AD&D, where I was writing custom classes for AD&D at 11 or 12 years old. Like I have not played a game of D&D that was not filled with homebrew since I started. And to some extent, I ask this question because I'm always confused by why anybody would confine themselves to just the rules on the page. That has never made any sense to me. That's not the way I want to play. I don't even understand what would make a person want to do that. But then, in terms of how to kind of grow, I guess, through that skepticism about unofficial content, I think you just have to keep posting it. And to some extent, like, I got very lucky in that the pugilist was just lightning in a bottle, and then suddenly I had a name, and suddenly people could buy other things from me and just say, this guy made the pugilist class, so this is going to be fine. And so I think I got lucky in that the pugilist was, like, I think the second thing I'd ever written for D&D, and so it just jump-started everything. And suddenly when I went to conferences, people wanted to talk to me and all this other stuff. I could do things because of that. And so I guess for people who are just getting started on that journey, or who are doing it and are frustrated by the lack of progress they're making, it's that you just have to keep doing it, and because you'll have your own lightning in a bottle thing if you keep doing it. And that's kind of, I think, what it takes to succeed as somebody who does homebrew or third-party stuff, is you have to just keep putting out stuff until something really resonates with a broad audience, and then they'll kind of start looking at all your other stuff, and you've got more options. I know that there's plenty of quotes about how perseverance is like the key ingredient of success or whatever, but that's definitely true here. There's nothing you can do except for just keep writing, keep designing.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, that sounds great. It's an interesting space. I want to share just a real quick story that kind of blew me away recently. I heard about this game, Microscope, by Ben Robbins, and I heard about it from Justin Gary's Think Like a Game Designer podcast. I'd never heard about it before, but I got a copy and I read through it. And Robbins clearly has played this multi-hour tabletop role-playing game. What he says somewhere, at least 150 times. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's played it over 100 times with friends and strangers, and then published this book that is, I don't know, $15 or $20 or something, right? That's not sustainable, right? Like, God bless the guy for his creativity, right? Like, this is a well-honed work, right? And when I read it, that's part of what jumps out, is like, this is masterfully crafted, which you can do if you have another income source. Because you can't sell enough copies of a little indie RPG to do that. But that's a space that is similar to what a lot of my students want to be able to do. Is they want to be able to make little indie video games, for example, right? But when there's, I forget the numbers now. How many games were released on Steam last year? 16,000? Maybe I'm off by an order of magnitude. I really can't remember. Way too many for anybody to get noticed, right? Like, it doesn't matter if your little game you put on itch.io is good, right? If nobody sees it, you might sell 10 copies. So that's a space where my curiosity has been, is this balance between the pure joy of making, right? But also the joy of sharing, and the fact that these things we enjoy making can really bring delight to other people if we can find the people for whom it's in that sweet spot where they're in the right place for it. Sorry, that's a long answer, but that's just kind of where part of my creative imagination has been.
Yeah, like, I really relate to, like, what Ben said about the, constantly just putting stuff out there, and the fact that, like, me saying that as well is also, like, a pretty privileged thing for me to say, or, like, kind of disjointed, because my experience as well, like you with the pugilist, was my flash in the bottle was the combat wheelchair, like. And I did not think that would go anywhere. I shared it on Twitter thinking, like, 5 people will enjoy that, I think. And most of them will be university friends. And then people who worked at Wizards and stuff like that started chiming in saying, like, oh no, this is, like, actually, like, a pretty solid idea. And I was like, oh, okay then. So I'll just keep revising it. And then, it kind of, I suddenly, like, whilst I was at university, had a name for making homebrew under, and especially when, of all people, Matt Mercer was like, hey, can I use this in my, like, D&D game in Critical Role, which was wild. But even beyond that, because I don't usually talk about it a lot on Twitter anyway, like not anymore since Twitter went to hell. There is that joy of, you have to have that joy of sharing regardless of if you make it big or not, because it's very easy to get burnt out if you don't care about something anymore. And it's the reason, at least for me, why there's been so many editions of the combat wheelchair, is because once I put one edition out, I'll suddenly have like another idea that I think is really cool, or someone in the replies will say, oh, here's like this very niche thing that came up, and I was wondering how the chair would interact with it. It's only ever happened like in my game, but I want to put an acknowledgement in for that. Like I had somebody ask about climbing in the wheelchair, and then I did research into people who do wheelchair rock climbing and things like that, and then put that in. And it's less about like me putting it out there and like being secure that it's going to do well because I have a name, and it's more what matters to me is that when somebody comes up to me and says, oh, I'm disabled, haven't been able to play a character like me before, and now I can, that makes me want to continue making homebrew, whether it's more disability content or subclasses or random classes for things, or just interesting lore to use in games. If you don't have that passion for it, I think you burn out very quickly. And if there's no joy in it as well, I do feel that sometimes that also can reflect in the work that you put out as well. If people can kind of tell you don't care about a rule set, if you really didn't care about it when you put it together and put it out there. But whilst a lot of the go-to is to put it on like places like DM's Guild and stuff, I would recommend branching out to more platforms, because there are the big TTRPG community on Twitter. It's also on Tumblr as well. Despite that website also being a hell site, it does have a very big TTRPG community. I've found like a massive one, and people are making homebrew on there all the time just for free, and like it's a really nice community to be part of. I think sharing it on other platforms and realizing there is more to getting your TTRPG stuff out there than just it has to go on DM's Guild, it can't go anywhere else, I think is also really important, because I have met a few people before that genuinely only thought that they could post on DM's Guild like it's some sort of brand of like how good the quality of it is, which like you said isn't always like an indicator, because there has been official content before that's been very lackluster and boring, and there's been unofficial content that's been absolute bangers. It should be official content, and it's really looking around in all these places and looking at different people and all their different types of work. I think that really that really helps, and like I don't know, just like interacting with like the community at large, really, and just realizing it's more than these like niche corners of the internet, or that you only have to restrict yourself to certain areas as well. So that's like kind of, just because something isn't on DM's Guild doesn't mean it's not good, or just because something is in an official D&D book doesn't mean it's not going to be bad or lackluster in any way. And I think it's like, I think people do kind of realize that, mostly if they're part of the homebrew scene themselves, they tend to realize that. But like people who just play the game and don't really interact much with like the game design part of it, don't tend to realize that. Like I've had people before who don't really interact with like the game design themselves, but like they will only buy things off DM's Guild, and I'm like, but you can get like that thing like on Twitter for free off somebody with like 5 followers who has like an insane amount of passion for it, and it's really cool to see that, and I do hope that that's something that changes in people's opinions, and that people can realize that that there are more places and more that you aren't just confined to like you've said in your question, that official means good, third party means it should be good enough to be official content, and then homebrew is just essentially, like Alyssa said, like the stigma of fanfic on it. So
something Mark, you and Paul said that I wanted to chime in on before I stop answering my own question, I guess. But that's Mark. You were really highlighting how much being a content creator means getting eyes on what you're doing, and I do want to say that to de-glamorize being a content creator for D&D or any other TTRPG a little bit, it kind of sucks. I hate advertising stuff. I hate trying to get people to look at the thing. I liked writing the thing. I don't want to also have to work on you looking at the thing I wrote. Like, that was the fun part, was writing it.
Yeah.
The not fun part is getting you to convincing you to look at it.
Creatives don't like marketing.
Yes, they don't. It's awful.
You get authors who are like, oh, I love writing the book. I cannot write a blurb to save my life. You know?
That's right. Exactly.
I can't summarize it for you.
Anytime I have to tell you why you should play it, it's just like, just look at it, please. I don't want to have to explain it.
Just read it, please.
So there's that part. So I do want to say, if you're somebody who aspires to be a game designer, I just want to let you know there's a bunch of skills you have to pick up that you are not going to want to learn, and it's painful and it's awful, and sometimes it's so bad that it'll make you think, I'm not sure if it's worth it. Sorry. But then that to Paul's point about the price of indie games, is I do think that's where, and I think people are acknowledging this in third-party content creators and bigger TTRPG companies are starting to try to swing this needle a little bit. And that's, I think it's anybody who's got a name for themselves responsibility to try to start raising prices on their own products, so that we can make this industry sustainable for other folks. Because if it's always a race to the bottom, then I think, as Paul mentioned, it's only going to be people who are wealthy enough to be able to, like, I mean, I spend thousands of dollars on art and editing and layout and stuff for every single thing I do. I get to subsidize this with my, my other work, I guess. And so I just think it's really important that myself and the other people who have the opportunity to raise their prices to make, a financially safe career for other people, that they should be doing that.
I was just going to say, to kind of tie also what Mark was saying, the idea of, like, you can get this stuff, for free, the things that people have, have done. I think that, we're lucky, with kind of the way that the things are set up, that so many people have, like, they put things out for free, but they have, like, a coffee, or they have, like, a tip jar, or they have a PayPal, right? And so I would just heartily encourage folks that, that if you have the means to throw, those little tips in for the folks whose stuff you use, whether they provide it for free or whether you recognize that they are probably, undervaluing the amount, if you have that, it's just a really wonderful opportunity to be able to acknowledge the fact that we do kind of have a race to the bottom, as you said, Benjamin. And I also just really wanted to just kind of go back to several minutes ago, Benjamin, when you said the idea of, you don't know why anybody would not want, like, why anyone would want to restrict themselves to the game. I just want to tease that out a little bit, because I think that a lot of that has to do with, like, the way that new players that DMs, so many DMs are, like, so new to the game, right? And they're scared by so many conversations that end up on, like, Reddit or Tumblr or Twitter about, like, this being so unbalanced or that being so unbalanced. And so they watch these conversations about, like, balance and something being overpowered, and those kind of conversations, even in relation to, like, the official stuff. And they go, well, then somebody else's stuff can't possibly, like, it's got to be worse. If WotC can't get the balance right, there's no hope in heck that, random person on DM's Guild or whatever can. And I also think that new DMs are the game is not easy. The game is hard. The game is crunchy. There are crunchier games, but, like, let's not kid ourselves. D&D is still a very crunchy game. It puts a lot of stress on GMs. And I think that a lot of GMs are just quick to just be like, you know what, official stuff only, because I don't want to deal with homebrew. I don't want to deal with, like, having to learn that stuff also. And so if, like, you're a DM who is, like listening and you're like concerned about homebrew and running it and balancing it, I would just encourage you to like, players got to learn their own shit. If somebody wants to come in and bring like a third party or a homebrewery thing, it's their responsibility to learn it really well and to figure out how it meshes with the game, and to be open to something being like needing to be tweaked, just like you might homebrew like a rule. It's not as scary as it seems, but I think that we just got to acknowledge that when we talk about homebrew and third party stuff, like, there's so many new DMs, so many of them have very little play experience. Their only experience is like watching an actual play. And it's daunting. And then on the other side, you have players who are showing up to those tables with GMs and DMs who are like, no. And I think that's just a side effect of like an adolescent player base and like dungeon master base, and the fact that the game is so heavy and requires so much, even more narrative focus than it did, you know, in the early days of AD&D, where it was like contained to a dungeon and you didn't always have to worry about all, you know, building a narrative arc in the same way.
Yeah. So my question, to frame it right, I don't consider myself in the audience for D&D. I don't consider myself part of the D&D community. I would have 25 years ago, but really that's not a space I'm in. And so there's probably a lot of conversations I haven't been aware of. But I am intrigued by the fact that, you know, when I said that first edition and fifth edition look different, I don't just mean mechanically. I mean, like, everything about them looks different. In the first edition artwork, right, it's all people being crushed, which is fascinating to me. And I spent a little bit of time mostly reading rulebooks, occasionally playing, but mostly reading rulebooks from the OSR community, and seeing the connection between things like that and roguelikes even, right? This idea of lots of death, right? Death is just part of the game. It's not a failure state, it's just part of the game. And I'm intrigued by that. That as somebody who grew up with games and loves all these different kinds of games, I'm intrigued by that transition from this is an experience where friends are going to get together, push people through a dungeon, and a lot of them are going to die, to we're remaking Marvel's Avengers with ourselves as the superheroes. And we're going to tell an epic story about these characters. And we know ahead of time it's going to be an epic story about these characters because they're the protagonists, which is very different. So I'm just curious to hear what people's thoughts are about that arc of this thing called Dungeons and Dragons, scare quotes.
So I feel like, because like first edition D&D, like, it obviously had its roots in like tabletop war games, very much had its roots there, and I think it kind of took that mindset over of characters, quote unquote, like, because they're not really like characters as we know them today, but they were more expendable, I guess, and it was more treated like, you know, you physically have to like brute force your way through everything. And I feel like as fantasy as a genre like kind of explored different topics and more characters, like in terms of like novels, things like that. I mean, you have like the Witcher series, you have like Terry Pratchett coming in, and all these like interesting characters who aren't always like, you know, like not what you would consider a typical kind of like soldier archetype, I guess. And they have interesting things to say, or like they're trying to make a statement about something. And then I feel like as that came in, more people felt like, oh, I want to play a character like that. Like, why can't I be a character who's kind of like a character in a book? You know, I want to be able to explore who this person is that I'm playing as. And I feel like even with, like you said about roguelikes, how you play like a pretty, like some older roguelikes, and it's all about, you know, punishment, like the death, and then like, but you learn from it and you try again. And even with newer versions of like that archetype of game, so like for example Hades and like Hades 2 coming out, even that has a big narrative like to it now, and you explore all of the characters in it. So I feel like a lot of that comes from, you know, the like novels, and like as fantasy I guess became more mainstream, more part of like the zeitgeist I guess. Like more people were reading about these characters and thought, why can't I do that too? There could be games where like we could do that, you know, and people started exploring into that. I feel like that's kind of the angle / impression that I got from it personally. I don't know if anybody agrees with that though. So yeah.
I wonder that's a great interpretation, Mark, and I wonder how OSR fits into there, because the only time I've played OSR has been with people younger than me, and I don't know if it's just a bunch of grown-yards playing OSR and wishing for the old days because they lost their old first edition books, but they also have lived through, right, the Terry Pratchett books and stuff, right? But I can't tell if that's two different, if it's people in different moods, if it's different audiences, if it's a cultural shift with some laggards, right? So I think your story is great, and I'm trying to just piece some of these
No,
things
yeah,
together.
like I feel that there's definitely like the two audiences, and sometimes, you know, it's kind of like a Venn diagram where you get that perfect like people meshed together at one part, and then you've got the people who want staunch like I want to go back to like early war games kind of vibe and everything, and other people who are like I would really like to just tell a story and not have to focus too much on the maths of it. I feel like it's just very like different audiences that just sometimes like coincide together and produce like things like Hades and like 5th edition D&D, where it seems to be like a blend of the both to try and give you the best of both worlds to kind of cater to both audiences, I guess.
I think that something with the like that we're seeing with the OSR is, I think it speaks to like what you were saying, Mark, about like fantasy as a genre kind of like, right, evolving and changing and growing, right? And so we've seen the change in the game, right? It's had this more narrative focus. I think there's been some changes. I think that some of, honestly, if you look at the timeline, I think that some of the more storytelling focus really actually came in the Ravenloft when that was added to 2nd edition, because that ended up going more of this like this deeper story, and adding this, you know, this more narrative opportunities. And then I think that it just kind of, I think that I would argue that that is one of, you know, AD&D's like big turning points. But I think that just the idea of like OSR folks, like, yes, I think that there are some, you know, of the grognards who are just wishing for, you know, D&D before it got, you know, ruined or changed. But I think that a lot of folks are just newer folks, like newer millennials who've played, you know, who got introduced to D&D through like a lot of the popular ways, you know, actual plays and all of that stuff. And the thing about 5th edition is that it pulled. 5th edition is, I mean, maybe I should have said that 5th edition is one of, you know, WotC's best innovations, because it pulled from 4th edition, it pulled from 3.5, and it went back and grabbed stuff from AD&D. And so you have new folks who end up at the tables with older folks, like you know, one of my favorite groups ended up that I spent, you know, a couple of years with, two wonderful older men who cut their teeth on 2nd edition and hadn't, you know, didn't even really want to play 3rd or 4th. They stuck with their AD&D until 5th came. And so you have this mingling of generations, and you have this sort of like swapping of stories. And then you have these, you know, 25, 30-year-olds who go, well, that sounds interesting. I would be interested in exploring that, because that's different and, you know, unique, and that somehow feels innovative compared to what I'm seeing all around me. I think it's kind of the same reason why, you know, we listen to stories from like our family, and we want to just go back and, you know, grab things from our past or grab things from like our familial stuff and bring them into like, you know, the modern times, because it's like our touchstone.
Yeah, like to kind of understand the roots of like where these things came from, because I mean, like, you even have it with video games, like for example, like you got all these new Star Wars games coming out, you know, and like they've got really good lightsaber combat, and they're really like good details, amazing graphics and everything. And yet I will still go back and play like Knights of the Old Republic, or I will go back and play like Republic Commando, things like that, because I want to see what came before that kind of led up to where we are now, and also like there is that thing as well where like you have some lore that like didn't transition into like 5th edition and such, and like people want to go back and visit it, or they feel it's not the same in 5th edition, and they've been told that like, oh, it was much better in like 3.5. Things like Spelljammer or Sigil, as well, like Planescape. And people are like, oh, it was much better in like such and such edition. Like I went back because Ravenloft is one of my favorite settings, and then I went back to the 2nd edition to read what it was like, because I kept being told it's really, really good. It's really good gothic horror, and then came back to 2nd edition, read it, and I was like, oh man, I have to use this now in like 5th edition because this is really good. I went back and even read like the novels as well, the I. Stroud novels, and then kind of fell into the loophole of, I don't know where that character comes from, but they exist in this series, so now I'm going to go read that series, and just kind of kept going and going until you kind of understand all of these like characters as they existed before, and like you get all these fun ideas that you can use in these new iterations of them. Like one of my favorites to use is Jarlaxle Baneray, but I use him as he existed in the Drizzt novels. So like he has his crop top on and his high heels, and he's really like flamboyant and great, and I love him so much because I liked him in 5th edition personality wise, and then when I went back and saw that they actually kind of changed all this stuff up, I was like, oh, but it'd be really fun if like he was more like his older self in like a modern setting in terms of D&D. And yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I think there is that kind of crossover where like you can pull like ideas from the older editions and put them in the new. And I've even seen people take the ideas from 5th edition and try and make them work in older editions as well, because they like the idea, but obviously the rules don't work with like 3.5, things like that. And I've seen people on like forums, like on subreddits and stuff, trying to figure out how to balance these rules that are like very streamlined and easy in 5th edition but are a little bit more clunky in 3.5. So yeah, I think it's like you said, it's also that like wanting to go back and like learn where all of these things came from, because it gives you a better understanding of where the thing like it currently is, like, and how it exists currently, and like everything that came before it that led up to it.
As somebody who has bought a whole pile of like past books that I have literally never played, I have actually only played and DM'd 5th edition. I have gone back and bought 4th edition stuff, 3.5, and AD&D stuff. So exactly what you said, Mark.
And I guess insert here, I must have answered the question as well in my own way, but now we're going to cut to Ben and his response.
This is actually a kind of a big pivot away from how the conversation has been going so far, but I wouldn't say that anecdotally, I play with my close friends all much prefer OSR type games, and this is just anecdotally, but they're all more nihilistic than me. Like they all have more pessimistic worldviews than I do. Like they think that that good things are not coming in the future, for like in a kind of broad sense. They believe that the future will be worse than the present. They think that effort is effort to make change is largely a misguided, naive thing to do. And so I think to them, the fantasy of repeatedly failing and dying, like there's something appealing about that to them because it feels like more true to their experience of life. Whereas that just makes me incredibly depressed. I don't need to suffer in a fantasy because I suffer enough in real life that I don't need to. I want to have hope. I want to hear stories about hope. And I'm just not interested in hearing a story about failure and like where ultimately the effort was not worth it, or that, people lost for and nothing good was accomplished.
No TPKs in your games then?
Not purposefully, unless I plan to set the real game in the underworld, which I have done before. I've had the whole party wipe so that then we can start the game in the underworld where they are fighting to come back to life. Oh, but I wonder if you blew that out, if just culturally there's a shift where people are more sensitive to stories about failure and loss because that feels too familiar to real life, where those sorts of things are like not an attractive fantasy because it feels too much like what, I mean, even if we just cut it down to strictly like looking at millennials' financial situation versus like older generations' financial situation, like we're all living paycheck to paycheck, no matter how good of a job we thought we landed, and we did land, like we're living paycheck to paycheck, and that's just what our lives are going to be like. And so maybe turning to kind of bleaker fantasies where there's a lot of death and failure is just too resonant to our lives to be, I mean, not to say it, not that's maybe it feels like an exaggeration, not that death is a common part of my life, but just I know what it feels like to feel like I can affect no change and to feel like my efforts are meaningless. I don't know what it feels like to feel like I can have a positive impact, that I can make the world a better place, like objectively a better place, and that I matter and that I'm important.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I'm resonating with that a lot. It reminds me of like the idea of like 10 candles, right? You know that when you play the game, you know, it's a horror game. Everybody at the end is going to die. Your idea is that how you get through it. I feel like maybe OSR is kind of like it's like a horror version of D&D in that capacity. That idea of, you know, safety is not a given, and you're exploring those kinds of, you know, stories about loss and death in a you know, safe, contained area, just like we explore other kinds of themes, you know, in horror as a genre. I think it's just that's a really, really interesting observation that you have there.
I think even then you still have that crossover of like where kinds of meets in the middle, sort of with certain games, like for example, like the Witcher tabletop role-playing game, because the world of the Witcher is it's very much a critique on, like, you know, social issues, things like that. If you want to play a Witcher, which everybody assumes, you know, is like a hero character, no, nobody likes you, nobody like is thankful for your efforts. Even when you do everything right, people don't like you for it. And yet the Witcher, I feel like, especially when like it's a well-written adventure in terms of like the lore and everything, it should capture that even when things go horribly wrong, you still made a difference in a way, that you still had an impact, and that like your actions at least mattered, even if it was only to one person, and even if the story ended sadly, you still come away from it feeling like you did all you could. And there's that kind of you know, that, like I said about the Venn diagram of like the people who really enjoy narrative and like wanting to overcome all these difficulties, and like you said, with people who are more nihilistic and find kind of, I guess, a comforting familiarity in the repeated punishment, you still have that kind of like Venn diagram crossover where certain games just manage to land that like perfect niche between the two. Because I found people who play The Witcher who are super into 5th edition, and then I've also had people at my table who've played Witcher who are really into like OSR and like wargaming, and they've both really enjoyed it. And I think one of the big things for that, especially for like the Witcher tabletop game, is the way the rules are written. It's very, it's like they give you all the rules and then they go, so pick exactly what you want for your game. So if you want it to be very wargamey, you've got all the rules to do it. If you want it to be more narrative and overcoming obstacles, you've got the means to do it as well. And I feel like, yeah, like you sometimes, even then, like with people who are very like seriously into their war games and like OSR and all that, you'll still find them participating in like newer games that have elements of things from, you know, that kind of 5th edition feel of triumphing, or having a big impact in like your story mattering and that kind of thing as well.
So, do you think that the new rules coming out this fall for the 2024 version of the 5e rules is 5.5? Is it merely a backward compatible update, or is it a 6th edition of the game?
Like from the bits and pieces that I've seen and that I've seen discussed, it feels like it's, at least from like I said, the bits that I've seen, it feels very revisioned. Like it feels like, especially in terms of some of the spells and stuff that people have talked about and certain aspects of the character builds, it feels like they've clarified more on certain rulings that, you know, were always like in conflict with the game, because a lot of the spells in 5e don't tend to take into account for like, because you'll always get a player that somehow knows how to find the loophole in the spell, and I feel that happened quite a lot with 5th edition, more so than some others, and I feel like that at least from the spell point of view, they've kind of realized that and acknowledged it, and have like started to emphasize certain aspects of the spells, more clarifying. That's what I feel like is going on. They're just clarifying more rules and neatening and tidying things up, because there were certainly like bits in 5th edition where it got very wordy at times, I feel, where it could have just been a more streamlined like sentence, but instead they gave like a paragraph when there didn't really need to be one. So I feel like a lot of that is happening, but I think until we get like an official announcement and at least like a proper look at like a big majority of the stuff that's coming out, I think we probably won't know. I'm kind of tentative in the 5.5 edition. I don't think it's going to be like a whole brand new edition, but I do think it's just kind of fixing issues that were there in the core rule set, so that when they make new content and new books and new settings, etc., they have a more streamlined, more secure and stable skeleton to kind of work off.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And I also think that dismissing it as merely like a cash grab, I think that does it a disservice. I think that is being dishonest about the state of like 5th edition after like 10 years. I think that we have to acknowledge that the way that the game is played like now versus like 2014 is completely different. Like we have actual plays, we have a huge narrative focus, like the kinds of games people play, the kinds of people that are coming to the table, what they want out of it, it's not the same. And we've had 10 years for like to see where things are really rubbing, where problems have cropped up and have needed to be addressed and have needed to be solved. And I think that those things needed to be done, right? There are fixes to classes that we have seen these huge conversations over and over again. How do we make marshals feel better? How do we deal with monks? Monks don't have anything to do other than stunning strike, etc., etc. I think that we need to be honest about the fact that like this game needed an update. Do you need to buy the books? Like, is everybody forced to? I don't think so. I think that you can continue to play 2014 if that's what you want to do. But I do think that what we're going to see is a much more patched and revised and like user-friendly and kind of friendly to what we're playing now version of the game. And I do think that it was time. You know, you can't just upload a patch like you can for Baldur's Gate 3. This is the way that we have to do it with paper and paper and pen games and paper and pen books. And so they haven't done this for 10 years. I don't think I just don't think it's fair to like and honest about what the game is and needs to just dismiss it as a cash grab. That's my opinion.
To add on to like you saying it's very much a dismissal of that, like yeah, it is, because like when you get video games, like for example like CD Projekt Red have been talking about toying with the idea of remastering The Witcher 1, right, with like the new engine and mechanics and everything, and yet nobody calls that a cash grab. Everyone's really excited for it because it's like, oh, it's a more refined version of the game that like I really enjoyed the narrative of but struggled with the tank controls on. So, you know, there's that, and like nobody calls that a cash grab. Everyone sees that like as an improvement. And, you know, seeing like a patched version, basically, like you said, of 5th edition, I don't feel like it's a cash grab. I feel like you said, it's been 10 years since those rules were made, and now is a chance to refine them and ensure that like when new books come out and like new ideas are pitched forward, new rules and stuff, that they are compatible with the core rule set.
This is kind of a punt, but I feel completely disinterested actually in the question, which is such a rude thing to say on a panel. But it's just I think they're gonna call it whatever they call it. It's all like a brand. Like this is so much more about the marketing, the business side of it, of like what is it versus what it isn't. And to be a little bit more cynical than Mark and Alyssa, I think this is probably not a creatively driven edition change. I think it's a commercially driven plan, and part of it is also the rollout of their virtual tabletop. And I think it's all about getting a lot of energy around the brand before they start really kind of circling the wagons around their virtual tabletop. And so I feel cynical about the new edition, even if I think there are creative things that are interesting about it and about the change. I am, especially because of the OGL debacle last year, but also just everything I hear whispers about. I think whatever D&D 2024 is, I feel too worried about what commercially it's going to do to third-party people to be too worried about how they'll eventually decide to label it.
Yeah, I was going to just make a quick comment in a similar direction, which is since what they tried to pull with the OGL, I won't give them any of my attention or money. But I sympathize with their business needs. It's probably a business decision. I mean, it's all business decisions. It's a business. But yeah, I don't trust them. I think they've shown themselves to be untrustworthy stewards. Take it for what it's worth.
Even though, I've said about being hopeful that it's going to be an improvement in some way, I will completely admit, Paul, I'm exactly the same. I have not given WotC any of my money since the whole debacle went down. The way that they backpedaled, claiming that they didn't say things that they definitely said, things like that, making everybody suddenly worried about, whether or not they now had rights to their own ideas, especially when WotC definitely knows how much their game relies on homebrew content and third-party content, because so many people use it, and so many people I know of who have enjoyed seeing a certain homebrew, and that's kind of how they wanted to get into D&D and play it more, and so yeah, it was very much like a stab in the back from them, really, and a very a very bad misstep on their part, one of many that they've made over the years, and it definitely wiped any good trust that I had with them. And I know that quite a lot of other people in the homebrew community also were yeah, no, we're not going to buy their things anymore. We'll still make things for the love of the game, but in terms of buying things from WotC, no.
And at this point, this is where I begin to wrap up the panel and thank everyone for their participation. So in the spirit of closing out the panel, I'm going to turn it over to my guests in a way that sounds natural, and I'm going to let them plug all their stuff and let you know where you can find them and support them. And without further ado, here is Ben to begin the conclusions.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Kurt. This has been a lot of fun. You can find me online at sterlingvermin.com, which is my website, also my store, where now my newer stuff is all being published there on the store, on the website. You can find me on Twitter, but probably not hear much from me because, like Mark, I don't visit much anymore. At Sterling Vermin. And you can also listen to my podcast, Dispel Magic, which is a show where we take spells from D&D and talk about how they would completely change the world if they actually existed in the setting.
I am still stubbornly on Twitter, somewhat unfortunately, but you can also find me on Blue Sky. I'm at Alyssa Visscher on both. I have a website, alyssa.visscher.com. I know my own website. I have a adventure that I wrote for Zipper on Disney and was published a couple of months ago. It's called Up the Beanstalk, and it is a story about traveling up the beanstalk like Jack and the Beanstalk, and storming a cloud giant's keep. It's very, very fun. And by the time that this is released, there should be some NDA stuff that will be public around then. So stay tuned.
Future Kurt stepping in here to say that that particular NDA thing is that Alyssa Visscher was actually consulted for the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide for the updated rules. So we certainly want to congratulate her and let her know that we certainly appreciate her contributions to this panel.
I am still sort of on Twitter from time to time at Mustangs Art, and it's the exact same on Blue Sky as well, same username. And I also have my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Mustangs Art. As well, the Combat Wheelchair version 4 should be coming out very soon. I was going to say like this month, July, but it might take another month. Who knows? I keep revising things at the minute and finding things that need fixing or changing up. I'm also writing a novel, which is almost done, and that will be probably self-published, I think, or maybe hopefully actually published. Who knows? For that either. But yeah, you can find me over there. I'll also plug as well. I'm working on Darrington Press's Daggerheart as well with Combat Wheelchair for the system. So please check out that. It's a really, really good system, very fun. And I think you guys will really enjoy it. Especially if you enjoy narrative and narrative combat as well. It's got like a good mix of like everything. I think that's everything for now.
You bet. I write on my blog over at paulgestwicki.blogspot.com. My last name is Gestwicki. I have to spell that a lot for a lot of people. So I blog over there. I've got a couple of programming tutorials on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/paulgestwicki. And if you're into techie stuff, I'm Dr. G, DOCTOR-G on both itch and GitHub. So you can check out some of the little jam projects and stuff that I work on there, including things like my Powered by the Apocalypse campy superhero role-playing game inspired by 1960s Batman, one of my favorite side projects.
So again, I just want to thank all my panelists from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for your patience and for your encouragement in private or in social media to help get this done. I was, honestly worried about working on this episode, but you know what? As I learned in re-listening to the panel, you know what? It's just like my panelists echoed about, putting yourself out there and trying and, doing the hard work, rolling up your sleeves and believing in yourself. And so maybe I shouldn't have put this off and worried so much. So again, thank you everybody for your support of the podcast and for these very fun and interesting parlay episodes that we get to do. So I can't wait to work to schedule the next one. Hopefully I'll make sure that it gets out to the Patreon supporters a little bit earlier than the general feed. Mea culpa. But thank you everybody, and we made it, season 5. So we'll see what waits for us in the future.
Bar to rock on 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.